cornerstone of the theory is a hypothesis that we've called the acquisition learning hypothesis. It says that we have two very different ways of going about the job of getting better in another language. You can acquire language, you can learn language, and they're very different. Acquisition I've described as a subconscious process. And subconscious really means two things. It means, first of all, while you're acquiring, you don't always know you're acquiring. It goes on below your level of awareness. For example, you're reading a book, you're listening to a conversation, you're listening to a presentation such as this one. You are, of course, listening to the presentation, you are reading the book, but without realizing it at the same time, you might be acquiring. Second, once you're finished acquiring, you're not always aware that anything has happened. Think everyone can acquire language. Everyone can pick up language subconsciously. Children acquire their first languages. Children acquire second languages. Adults acquire language. The ability to subconsciously pick up language does not disappear when you enter school. It does not disappear when you become a teenager. It doesn't disappear when you get older. It's with us forever. We think the language acquisition device never shuts off. Very different from acquisition is what we call learning. That's what most of us did in school. Learning is knowing about language, conscious knowledge of language, in English from that position. When you come out with a sentence easily, it comes from what you've acquired, not from what you've learned. All the rules that you learned in school do only one thing for you. They act as a monitor or an editor. So let's matter where you look. The important role is with acquisition. Acquisition gives us fluency and accuracy. For the adult, and I'd also like to admit this to you, no one was more disappointed to discover this than me. As I mentioned briefly at the beginning of this discussion, my graduate work was in grammar. My PhD is in grammar. Like many language teachers today, I love grammar. My life used to revolve around grammar. My best friends are grammarians. I love to discuss relative clauses. The problem is that that's not how language acquisition happens. Language acquisition does not happen by learning grammar rules, by memorizing vocabulary lists. This leads then to our major point. If acquisition is more important than learning, we must ask how it happens. How do we help people acquire language? This is, of course, the way we acquire language is amazingly simple. We acquire language when we understand messages. When people speak to us in another language and we understand what they say, or we read something in another language and we understand the message, language acquisition will take place. Messages people understand, what we call comprehensible input. The language acquisition device goes to work. Okay, so we acquire language when we understand it. This major idea of comprehensible input has two corollaries. One corollary has to do with speaking. Talking is not practicing. The ability to speak another language is a result of acquiring it, not its cause. For example, if you want to improve your English, it will not help you to speak English to yourself as you drive to work in the morning in your car. If you want to improve your French, it will not help you to close the bathroom door and speak French to the mirror. I used to think those things help. Now I'm convinced they don't. The ability to speak a language is a result of getting language acquisition, not its cause. Probably the worst problem, though, with the grammatical syllabus is that it's boring. It's very hard to present messages that are interesting and comprehensible to people when our hidden agenda is the relative clause or any other rule. What we're now saying is if we give people messages that are interesting and comprehensible, grammar to a large extent takes care of itself. And as most of us who've taught language know, this is easily difficult enough. For language acquisition to really proceed optimally, anxiety should be zero. Now, this has happened to some of us. If you've been in a situation where you're so involved in speaking another language, a language you may not control very well, that you temporarily forget that you're dealing with another language, when anxiety is temporarily zero, when you're totally focused on the message, that's when you're acquiring. If the student isn't motivated, if self-esteem is low, if anxiety is high, if the student is on the defensive, to borrow a phrase from Earl Stevick, if he thinks the language class is a place where his weaknesses will be revealed, not a place where he'll get new input, a block goes up. We call this block the affective filter. When the filter is up, the student may understand the input, but the input won't reach those parts of the brain that do language acquisition. The block will keep it out. Somewhere in the brain, according to Chomsky, is a language acquisition device. For acquisition to happen, comprehensible input must enter the language acquisition device. Teach it. The first question that comes up is whether we even need language classes at all. Most people say no. Most people don't believe in language classes. And if I phrase the question correctly, I'm sure that some of you will find yourself not believing in language classes. Let's say, for example, that you're at a party. Someone discovers that you're interested in language, and of course they say to you, you know, I've always wanted to learn, let's say, French. What do we tell them? Go to the local school and take French 1, go to the university and take beginning French, go to the private language school and take beginning French. We don't say that. We say things like, go to France, go to Canada, go to Quebec, go to the country. It seems reasonable, but it's bad advice. What would happen if I went to Mexico, which is 2.5 hours away, to try to learn to speak Spanish? I wouldn't understand anything. It would simply be noise. It would be a waste of time. But if I went to a well-taught Spanish class, a class taught correctly, the first day I could get 45 minutes of comprehensible input. That's what language classes are for. Language classes are designed to give you the comprehensible input that the outside world can only give you with great difficulty. I'll make mistakes. The goal of the language class, of the beginning language class, is not to make you perfect. The goal of the language class is to make you an intermediate, so you can then get more comprehensible input from the outside world. Now, our world is more valuable. Acquisition will come faster on the outside, but our goal is to put students in a position so they can take advantage of the input on the outside.